in many, many ways. And I really wanted a role in which I could start to really change things. So my beginning is in I went to a grammar school, and coming out of that, I said, oh, I don't really know what I want to do. So I went to university and had the opportunity to work in the city for my internships, and also to intern in politics. And both seemed very flawed systems. And I guess in reaction and in response to my faith and what I would think and talk about in my life as being most important, didn't really gel with what I was seeing at work. And I was really looking for that opportunity to bring the two together. So I started a startup straight after university and ran that for 6 years with a co-founder. And again, it was looking at social and environmental impact, but really looking at the numbers behind it, and how could we start to look at the data and start to use that to inform our decisions. That for me still wasn't quite getting there in what that difference could be that I make. And as well as this work, I'm an artist. So again, I keep getting this call, this voice to say, you know, how are you responding to your brothers and sisters who are calling out to say the way we're living isn't sustainable, the way we're living isn't fair. And last year, I started working at Operation Noah on the Right Now campaign, and it really felt like all the things that I had needed to see in my day-to-day work finally came together. I will share my slide. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. Please nod or wave if you're seeing anything other than a slide with a windmill, cherry sunshine that we're not having right now. Is that all right? Can you see that okay? Wonderful, thanks. So in thinking about, you know, my growth in faith and my understanding of the environmental crisis, really it was reading Laudato Si where everything crystallized, and I had wanted to not quite look at this mess that we were creating and not quite own my part in that mess that we were creating, because that would then require a conversion and a repentance in my heart and in my actions and in what I did practically as well. And that encyclical by Pope Francis was very clear, stark, direct, painful to read in many ways because it was so honest. But it also pointed to the duty that we have as Christians to respond. And also, given my background, you know, I had grown up in farms in Zimbabwe, seeing how the earth is such a core part of who we are, and how it nourishes us and how we ought to respect it. And these were all part of my values, but again, it was quite convenient to not quite pay too much attention. So when this role came up at Operation Noah, I felt, well, God is not always subtle, and I really had to respond. And so it's been a year, and we've been working with churches to respond to the climate crisis. And what I really loved was the specific way in which we do that, which is in supporting churches to look at their resources. So the campaign that I work on is called the Right Now campaign. And we look at how churches can use their investments to make a difference in the world. Several churches have declared a climate emergency. So many people, you know, this might once have been a sort of fringe conversation, but many people have recognized the climate emergency. And what I really loved about this campaign was the practical way in which it responded, because it said, okay, we recognize this, we pray about it, we do put it in God's hands, but we also have to act and take practical steps. And what practical steps can we take that are strategic, in that what we do can influence others and can be a real sign and prophetic in the world? And so thinking about fossil fuel divestment in that context, for me was really motivating, and it does get me up every day in the morning. And when we talk about divestment, what we mean is disinvesting, so stopping investing in fossil fuel companies and making a commitment not to invest in those types of companies in the future. And this is a global movement. Many institutions with all sorts of mandates, from pension funds to education institutions, many universities have also been part of this movement. And that's part of what gives it its power, is that as an individual, I can feel like actually this climate crisis is overwhelming and the changes that we need to make are so large. How does my recycling, my cycling, I cycle across London, how does my eating less meat, how does my consuming less make a difference? And so part of what I really loved about this was, well, you can work with others to really increase the impact, to really amplify the actions that we take. And it really sends out a message to the world to say, these types of organizations no longer have our social contract. We no longer want to endorse this way of doing business, this way of being in the world. And we recognize that we need to support a different future, and we need to move those resources from what is damaging towards a brighter and cleaner future that is actually accessible to more people, so that we have both a green, and this is something I'm really passionate about, a green change, as well as a really just change and a just future. I could go on, but let me get through a couple more of these. And that last point about a just future is really important to me. And this quote by Dr. Rowan Williams really resonated. And he talks about divestment sending a positive and hopeful message to the people of this country. Think about floods in parts of the UK, pollution in inner cities, and how that's impacting people here. And also those in vulnerable communities across the globe who will be most immediately affected by climate-related disasters. And so when we think about major oil companies and why is this necessary, surely it can't be doing too much harm. And we all use fossil fuels in our daily lives, in transport, etc. But one of the things that I mentioned earlier about that social contract is to start to say we need to create the pressure to change things both in government and in our consumer behavior. And in saying that we no longer support oil companies, we're really giving that accountability, that we recognize the way in which these companies have held us back in understanding the effects of the climate crisis, in holding back governments from responding with regulation. And we saw that even during the COVID crisis, these companies were still lobbying against climate action, and were taking advantage of that crisis to try and, really move backwards in the climate responses that governments had made, which aren't even far enough, but they were still trying to get these repealed by pouring lots of money into lobbying groups. And when we see adverts, before lockdown, I remember being in Euston Station and there was a great big banner talking about reimagining energy. And I thought, oh, well, that looks positive. And it didn't take very much research to understand that actually that some of the money from oil companies is going into green energy, but the vast majority, over 90%, is still going into exploration, extraction, and production of fossil fuel products. And so I really wanted to be very clear that we don't have that much time, and we don't have that much by way of opportunity to indulge in looking slightly aside from what we see as reality. And we really need to think about what this means on a longer term basis. And that policy of sort of, oh, we're putting some money towards renewables and, you know, trying to stall government activity can't still turn the tide back. Many fossil fuel companies have recognized that increasing legislation, moving towards net zero, moving towards a cleaner future means that a lot of their products cannot be used. They have to stay in the ground. And what that does is say, well, all that extra capital that they were investing to extract, to produce fossil fuels, those assets are going to be worthless. And Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, said, you know, as investors, they need to be able to make the argument and to be clear about what they're going to do with all these stranded assets. So stranded assets being assets where they've been invested into making, you know, new refineries or exploring in endangered parts of the world. So they need to make the argument to be clear about why that is going to be the case if a substantial proportion of those assets are going to be worthless. Why would you continue investing in those forms of production? And a question for every company, every financial institution, and every asset manager, pension fund, or insurer has to be, well, what's your plan? You know, when we do move to renewables, which are cheaper, what is it that you're going to do? How are you going to keep our investments safe? And we've seen that many investors have started dropping their fossil fuel investments over the last year. For example, there's an increasing number of fossil-free funds. For example, like Epworth Investment Management, which is a subsidiary of the Central Finance Board of the Methodist Church, CCLA, which also manages some of the Church of England's funds, as well as those of many dioceses and local churches. All these in the last year have been dropping their fossil fuel funds. And I should add that as a charity, we obviously cannot provide financial advice. What I want to do is illustrate how people are recognizing that this is not a sound financial investment, and it's not a responsible one going forward. And even the oil companies themselves are recognizing that divestment works, and they're starting to feel that pressure. In the Shell annual report a couple of years ago, the CEO says, you know, some groups are pressuring certain investors to divest their investments in fossil fuel companies. If this were to continue, it could have a material adverse effect on the price of our securities and our ability to access equity capital markets. Essentially, what this means is it becomes more and more expensive for oil and gas companies to borrow money to fund that extraction, exploration, and production of their fossil fuel companies. So it becomes increasingly hard for them to do business, which we want to do because we want them to move to renewable energy. Pope Francis and the Vatican, for the first time last year, gave very clear directions that as members of the church, as Christians, we have to promote ethical, responsible, and integral criteria for investment in decision-making, taking care not to support companies that harm human or social ecology or environmental ecology, for example, through the use of fossil fuels. So that was the first time that there was a very direct recommendation that church organizations divest from fossil fuel companies. And this is a really important year. The eyes of the world are going to be looking at the UK, going to be looking at our response. And as Cristina Figueres, who is the UN climate chief at the time of the Paris Agreement, has said, governments and financial leaders are already considering recovery packages for an economy so badly hit by the virus. Surprisingly, these decisions will be the most important decisions on climate change. If investments kickstart the paralyzed economy by directing money into high carbon assets and industries, we will be locked out of our current potential to bend the curve of emissions this decade. And this decade is specifically important to avoid some of those tipping points that scientists have been warning us about. And where do churches stand so far? I don't know if many will have kept in touch with where their denomination is. This is slightly out of date in that one more Catholic diocese has now divested, which is great to see, but we really want to see them all moving in this direction and really divesting fully out of fossil fuels and sending out that clear message that we as churches are actually supporting this clean investment. We're supporting this clean energy movement. And what does that mean when we say they've made this divestment commitment? So groups interested in joining, I'll speak to you shortly about the global divestment announcement, which has been a big part of what I do in my day-to-day job. But they'll have committed to moving their fossil fuel investments within at least the next 5 years, if not sooner. They'll divest from any pooled investments as well. And they do not hold any fossil fuel investments and also will not do so in the future. So even churches who don't currently hold any fossil fuel investments and have, for example, only a bank account, it can still make a very powerful statement to pledge not to do that. So if you receive, bequeath some money and that church suddenly has investments, they will still be pledging to say, if that includes oil company shares, for example, we will sell those so that we're divesting in the future as well as making this statement today. And within my role, I get to help churches think about how to do this. So whether it's helping people as they prepare for parish council meetings or thinking about how to bring this up and raise it at a national church meeting, for example. There's a step-by-step guide which is available on the ON website, which I will share in the chat shortly. And it can help you to see, where is my church on this? How many, I gave you the table earlier, how many of those churches are local to me? Who can I connect with to get our denomination moving further and faster? I also really, I read this almost every other day at work, and it still seems incredibly important. A statement from Desmond Tutu and Al Gore on divestment, and they talk about any organization committed to operating responsibly has a moral imperative to stop participating in financing the destruction of human civilization's future and to instead invest in renewable sources of energy. That is particularly important for institutions that aspire to provide leadership in our society and to become part of the solution to the climate crisis. And as Christians, we may live in a more secular UK, but people still do look to churches for that guidance. And especially as we've seen during the COVID crisis, people have turned more to Christian organizations to respond with that compassion. And so this continues to strike me. I think I've spoken for probably slightly longer than my allotted time. I would now like to turn over to you, to your response. And I think we'll break out now into small groups. And I have a couple of questions that you may want to consider in those groups. You may want to talk about, what struck you. Perhaps there was something that you hadn't thought about before this evening, and perhaps share that. But also in thinking about your denomination, where do you think campaigning would have the greatest impact in your church denomination? And what do you think are the barriers you would face to getting your church, whether it's locally or nationally, to divest, and how might you overcome them? And I will then attempt to answer some of those questions, if you have any to bring back to me as well.
What would be really good is if some of you might find you'll be in the same groups as before. We're going to have, I think we said 7 minutes, but you'll have chance just to talk about those questions, and maybe you want a spokesperson, maybe you want to go one-on-one. But let's break out now for 7 minutes. I think that's what you said, Bokani, and look forward to seeing you soon. We'd have 2 ways of doing this. You can write it in the chat and we'll have a look and see what comes through. But otherwise, put your hand up either physically or, better still, go down to reactions on the bottom right of your screen, what is on mine, and that puts you to the top of the gallery view so everyone can see you, and we absolutely we notice you, so we're not ignoring anyone. So in the most simplistic way, whatever, let's what thoughts have we got? By all means, who would like to raise an issue or a question for Bokani, or make a comment?
Yeah, so
who's that?
We discussed it's Dino Tassar.
Okay, that's fine. Put your hand up.
I go to a church.
Yeah, go for it.
I go to a Church of England church in Reading. We discussed in our group about our churches and their record for divesting of fossil fuels and other investments which might be undesirable. And the feeling was that churches are not too bad at this kind of thing. But where we really wanted help and guidance was, as individuals, what should we be doing about our investment decisions? And each one of us could go and investigate various funds and what the holdings of those funds are, but that's quite a difficult and laborious and time-consuming process. And also there's a lot of greenwashing going on, whereby funds are made to appear to be greener than they actually are. And to actually get to the bottom of that, you actually have to do a lot of forensic examination to determine whether a fund really contains companies or assets that you would be happy to hold. So we felt there's a real need, rather than us as individuals all going and doing our own investigations, for there to be more broad guidelines as to where we should be investing, which funds should we hold, which companies should we not invest in, and as well as churches, it's more as individuals as well, and we can then help members of our respective churches to be as ethical in their own personal investment decisions as we are collectively as churches.
Okay, Bokani.
I think I will start with the disclaimer again. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not FCA regulated. So I completely agree with the point of, as an individual trying to find this information can be difficult. I will share some resources with Stefan that talk to those, and I think some people have mentioned some banks as well that are in this resource, where it's for individuals. The one thing that I would also say is, if you already have an investment manager, they work for you. Ask the questions, really raise it with them, because that will also start changing those organizations. What we've seen with some of the churches that have divested is they've gone to their managers and said, look, if you can't support us with a fossil-free fund, we're actually going to move all our funds. and that investment manager has then created fossil-free funds for them. Other people have then wanted to invest in those because now they knew they existed. So it really creates a snowball effect. So I would really encourage you to, if you already have an investment manager that you're working with, to really bring up these questions with them. And yes, I will also send this. I have a resource that's specifically on pensions, but I think there's another one on savings as well.
Okay,
that'll be very useful. Thank you.
We'll put it. Rebecca.
Okay, I'm from a Methodist church, and I was speaking to someone who was also from a Methodist church. Yeah, one of the main barriers the church is faced is just not having the options available. I was at the Methodist Operation Noah meeting a couple of weeks ago, which it looks like there might actually be an option available now, and I've already, well, in fact, another member of the church picked it up even before I did. So perhaps there'll be some change there. But the thing is, it has been, it's an ongoing problem. If you want a proper future-looking ethical investment, the options just aren't there. And should declare an interest here. I'm a board member of Share Action, and an ethical investment charity. Hopefully some of you have heard of it. I mean, I just take every opportunity to tell people there is a market. There's a market for this. Whoever comes up with a really good ethical and fossil-free investment is going to make a fortune, because the market's there. So it's not quite the way everyone put it, but that's the language which they will understand. In response to the question about impact, if the Methodist Church as a whole divested, or any of the other big churches, probably more so if it was the Church of England or the Catholic Church, that will be a newsworthy event, and then other people would hear about it and start thinking, should I be doing this as well? And if people are thinking, there was a rather depressing message in the Financial Times last week from someone who clearly just thought is all that matters is their own interests. Well, people ought to recognise that it is in their interest to protect the environment. If they don't expect to live long enough to see climate change, their relatives certainly will. And also to protect their assets, because many of the fossil fuel assets are going to become worthless. Okay, I probably said more than I should say. That's probably my
Connie.
So I should let now.
I barely have anything to say to that. That's great. Everything Rebecca said. I think the point you make about churches nationally divesting is an important one. And I'd say I think part of Dino's earlier comment was that the churches seem to do well in general. Yes, but the Church of England is still investing in very highly polluting companies, Exxon, for example, BP, Shell, etc. And that's at the national level. So yes, if they were to move, that's billions of pounds moving away from fossil fuels. And as Rebecca says, what that says in the world is this is a direction we are going in, and it makes a really big impact. There are more funds now than I think there's 5 or 6 which churches and charities can invest in now that are now fossil free. But again, there's absolutely room for more. And all those also, the more we support them, the better that they perform and do as well. So again, I will pop that in the chat, which organizations those are. Epworth, which I think manages the CFB, or is part of the CFB, Central Finance Board for the Methodist Church, has a fossil-free climate stewardship fund now.
There's some good ones coming up in the chat, which I'll share the chat at the end of this and send it all out to you. I mean, one of the questions that came up in our group was about personal investment. I mean, I've had to manage my own pension because my company went bust, and the difficulties of doing that. But that there seems to be 2 types of funds: the ones which aren't doing bad stuff, they've stopped fossil fuels, and that's where I've got to. And then there's the high risk ones, which is the ones that are really investing heavily in renewables.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you choose one or the other, or how do you manage that mix? How do you what's more important?
This is where, again, I'm like, oh, I think I want to be very clear that I can't say this is how you should manage your risk appetite within investments. And I would really think carefully about some of those stranded assets, the ways in which oil companies have been borrowing money in order to pay dividends, the fact that that isn't a sustainable thing. And we saw just last year, they had to cut dividends by over 2/3 for the first time in 25 years or so. So those things to me suggest that actually oil companies are the risky companies. But that being said, let me share the pensions guide that we were talking about this afternoon with my colleague, which I hope will be helpful. And that has several different suggestions in terms of which pensions you might look at, and it's relatively recent. This is from last year. So I think that is definitely worth having a look at. I will also, there's another link that I think I'll have to send that in the,
send that
in the follow-up email.
Great. Can we go over to Sally then? In that case, Sally, run them.
Thank you. Just a quickie, I'm in the United Reformed Church, and we were quite ahead of the game. I mean, for instance, we've been an eco church for many years, decades. But we know of people, both individuals and churches, that have lost an awful lot from ethical investments. So I'm just saying, be really, really careful and make sure you diversify. It's just been really, really frightening. That's why some of the fund managers, you're having to push them, because they're not stupid and they know how risky some of this is. And if it's your pension, you might want to risk your pension, but they won't. It'll be against the FCA rules for them to risk your pension. So I'm just saying, diversify and be super careful, because I'm talking about hundreds of thousands that have been lost.
And I would also add to that, I think a big part of it is working with professionals for that reason. When looking at any investments, I think having a very clear set of options and having clear advice from people whose day job it is to compare that risk is really, really important. And that's, a big part of why I emphasize my role. We're a charity. What we can do is show you where we have very grave concerns, but it's really important as you actually make the decisions to work with professionals, investment professionals on that.
Okay, and then we go to John Twidell. You have to,
people to be interested in local renewable energy co-ops, because whilst it is on paper risky, I don't think if you know the people involved, usually volunteers, you know what they've invested in, usually wind, solar, biomass systems, occasionally hydro, but the great opportunity is to be personally involved. And usually in terms of investment, it's about 3 to 5% annual return.
Thank you for that. And then I saw Catherine. Catherine, you actually sent us a question by email, I believe. Would you like to share it yourself, or would you like me to read it for you?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to get answered. Having heard everybody's reticence to say anything, I've got, I, like many people, invest in my personal pension. It's with an organisation in London which is pretty ruthless. I was gobsmacked that it didn't lose money last year, but it didn't. And they, they make a noise about being ethically aware, and they've got some ethical funds. I could put all my money in the ethical funds, but I just didn't know if that was the best way to go about things, or whether there was other organisations, other ways of actually putting some, or maybe a portion of that money to work, and where I feel it might make a bit more difference.
I think I did read the question, and thank you for sending it ahead. So again, with the disclaimer, I do think what John mentioned about, you know, looking at projects locally as well is a good point. But I would also say, again, it's really worth discussing those with investment professionals who can say, you know, when you look at a local project, what are their projections for that next few years? Yes, the first few years could be up and down. That's the case with all investments. And really, when you're looking at long-term, ethical investments do better. The sustainable investments do perform well, but that's over a long term. And I guess that's as close to an answer as I can give. You know.
May I share, Bokani? I mean, we talked in our group. I worked for 28 years for what I felt was a very good company indeed. I left it, and 6 years later it went bust. It was called Carillion, and when the things were going pear-shaped, I pulled out my pension, gold-plated pension, into a separate fund, and ended up being responsible for managing my own pension. And I got what you said. I got an investment manager on board, and he did all the right things to maximize investment, and then started talking to him about wanting to go ethical. And what he did was source, and it was a real struggle at first. He really didn't want to do it. He really, really did not want to do this. But he pulled through, and there's a whole bunch of stuff you can invest in. And out of 500, he found 50 that fit the criteria. And this is in the not doing bad things criteria, as opposed to doing good things, which is another story, which where I'm in not doing bad things. I want to start learning about more investing in good things. And so out of those 50 funds, he could select the 10, 20, spreading the risk in a way that was ethical and give the risk about, you know, things going really pear-shaped. So it is possible to do. I think you're right. It needs an investor. But the other piece I wanted to bring was Bill Gates' new book about the planet. And he talks, I'm just in about chapter 4, he talks about he's investing in renewable energy and how high risk it is and how long term it sometimes is for these new technologies that are really going to transform. But you've got to do some. So we just get behind some of that as part of our portfolio.
Yeah.
Anyway, shut up, Stefan. Who's next? Anyone? Any more? So, Charles, I saw your hand first. If you want to be guaranteed to get on, put your electronic hand up and then we'll definitely see you.
So I put a question in the chat about progressive legislation, and I'd like to know, hello?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I can hear you, Charles.
Yeah, progressive legislation, who do you see as supporting that?
As in, who do I support politically? Or?
No, this is progressive legislation.
I don't think I know. Is this the CEE bill?
No. This is
I'm
a
afraid
bill.
I don't.
This is a bill to control two things. One is debt from one country to another is controlled in London and New York, and also the effect on the legislation concerning pension managers. So if you wrote to your pension manager and say you'd like them to extract less money from, say, Africa, they can't do that because they have a duty of care to get as much as possible. So it's addressing that particular issue in progressive legislation.
I am afraid that is out of my purview, but I am very interested and will be going to look into it more.
I'll email you.
Please do, yeah.
Thank you.
Speaking of which, I should give my details. I'll share my.
We will share those. I will share that in an email to everyone. We're
Right.
now right at the end of our time, because we commit to letting you go after 1 hour to your evenings, your families, etc. So we're going to wrap things up. If you want to go, you can go. If possible, Bokani, those who want to stay on and chat a bit more informally, we would love to. It's often sometimes the best chat when the numbers reduce a little bit. So we're going to finish with a prayer.
Can I also, I had extra slides that I didn't get through, but encourage you all to, we've got, I'll do a quick 1 minute per thing.
No, you haven't got that.
less than a minute. Okay.
I will share.
Please
the
do
slides.
share, yes, on my behalf. We've got a webinar coming up, and people can be involved in the global divestment announcement. Again, please feel free to email me, and we'll share my email in the follow-up email as well. Would you like me to say the prayer, or?
Why don't we do that? You pray us through that. So.
Let us pray. Spirit of God, who hovered over the waters, harness your power in us to live faithfully and in harmony with the rhythms of righteousness for the restoration of creation and the glory of your name. Amen.
Amen. Well, Bokani, I want to formally really thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. It's been really fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The next session we have in 2 weeks' time, we have Extinction Rebellion to talk to us about the key role of the Citizens' Assembly in UK democracy. They're great people, and actually absolutely lovely people, actually, all ones I've met. So do come back to us for that if you're interested in there. So if you'd like to stay for a bit more informal discussion, do. But if you'd like to leave, now's a good time to drop off and do your own thing. Thank you so much.